Welcome to the Valley Today, a public service presentation of KAIL-TV. Water is this episode's subject. We all need it, and it seems to be harder every year to come by. And if water won't come to us, we'll come to it. That's what Zim Industries does. They go and find water. Join us as we visit with Kurt and Bob Zimmerer of Zim Industries. It's up next on the Valley Today.
Well, welcome to the Valley Today, and we have the distinct pleasure of being with Zim Industries. Zim Industries, I gotta correct myself there, and we are in a construction zone of sorts, and I'm with Kurt Zimmer. And the reason why we're here today is something that's very near and dear to us all. It involves water. And Zim Industries is a major pumping and well digging company in the San Joaquin Valley. They travel just about everywhere in the Central Valley, don't you?
Central Valley and out of state. Yes.
Out of state as well. Can you give me a little history on how your company evolved and got into the well drilling business?
Absolutely. 1979, my father, my two uncles formed a company for irrigation sales and service purposes, and that went on for 3 or 4 years, and we ran into the issues of abundant water at that time and cheap labor to move the irrigation systems for flood or drip or whatnot. And so as a need of necessity to stay alive, we integrated into pump business in the early 80s.
Now that's an interesting point right there. To stay alive, was the drip systems not as prolific as they are now, and it was just a beginning industry that you just couldn't get traction on? And then you developed into the well business?
Well, we weren't so much in the drip systems. We were in the center pivot and the laterals, the above ground.
Yes.
I think you've probably seen them out of Fresno
Yes.
State.
Yes.
So that was more of the new technology we were trying to implement into California, and those two issues that I referred to really prevented people from making that investment, and they opted to do more flood irrigation. And due to the abundant water and the cheap labor.
Interestingly enough, and I don't mean to interrupt you there, Bob and I went out to a section of the West Valley where they have those circular irrigating devices, and they're now tapped into computers and so forth. So whatever happened in the original emphasis on what you were putting on it back then is now starting to take hold, I believe.
Correct.
And we were out there with, I think it was the University of UC Davis, and another university in connection with Fresno State to do research on that kind of watering. But besides that, we're getting back to the well drilling here. And tell me again your plan of attack after you had gotten into that irrigation stuff and you went to the well digging.
Yeah, so in the early 80s we got into the pump business, and then we started working for a lot of well drillers. And in the early 90s, we had an opportunity to buy a company out of Bakersfield called Bakersfield Well and Pump. So at that point, we decided to go full bore into the well drilling business as well as the pump repair and installation business.
Okay, so what year again are we talking about?
1993.
How was the abundance of water in 1993? Pretty easily had?
It was, there were years that it was dry, and then, years that they had plenty of water.
Yes.
But we found that by integrating into pump and well drilling, we had a full service water system. Any water needs that any customers had, we could provide that. And then geographically, we extended out to other states: Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah.
Yes, yes. Now, recently we had a big deal here in Fresno. It happens annually, and you had an opportunity to go out to the Ag Show. I understand there's over 1,400 vendors out there, and over 100,000 people show up for this. Now, did you have a booth space, or were you just an observer this time?
We were just an observer this year. This year we've been rather busy in the agricultural market, and it was interesting to go down there and see the people, though. That there was, like you said, 1,400 booths.
1,400 booths.
All kinds of participants.
Traffic jams.
Traffic jams. I went on Thursday, and it was still busy, and that's normally their light day. So
yeah, and I imagine that emphasis was heavy on the water issues because that's very poignant for all of us right now. all kinds of new designs to shield root structures, and as we discussed earlier, overhead sprinkler and irrigation systems. So it must have been quite an affair for you to see all of these new technologies. Are there any things that you as a company are looking at to perhaps jump into, or are you pretty well set with what your technologies are at this point?
There might be some opportunities down the road. We're really focusing on providing the wells and the pumps at this point, though.
Okay. Well, very good. Then I'd like to get into some of the reasons really why we're here, besides having the opportunity to talk to a pro like you. Water levels in the Fresno County and the outside areas. I've heard reports that, say back in 1949 or so, they only had to go 50 feet deep for water. Then in the early 90s, it was more like 170 feet. What do you think the depths are now that we're getting to find water? Is it really dropping that much more, and is it exponentially getting worse?
You know, that all depends. There's years, you know, the wet years that the water table do come back.
Yes.
The dry years, you're right, the water tables do drop, and people are needing to either extend their pumps, in some cases re-drill wells that will go deep enough to capture the water,
Yes.
water levels that are dropping.
So I guess it's a very important point as to where you're located in the valley. I recall that when they were reintroducing the San Joaquin River flow, that there was certain bends that the river would take, but those guys on the bends, they were getting saturated out there. So they had to take some technology out there to determine how much infiltration the water was causing the crops and getting into the roots of the trees and maybe even rotting them, I don't know. But that was an unfortunate circumstance of having too much water that you weren't planning on a normal cycle. It's called a reintroduction of a river. But then there are other places where you're having to sink wells hundreds of feet, 1,000 feet?
Thousands of feet. Yes.
Thousands of feet. And also this brings up another point that I've read recently. Land is sinking in places. Land is actually, the geology of the land has sunk several feet in places, and they attribute it to well pumping. And that's not your fault, because you're trying to find the water for farmers and everybody to survive on. But have you seen or encountered anything like that where you've seen or heard about land sinking, like a sinkhole?
It's not so much a sinkhole. What occurs is what we call subsidence. So when you pull water out of a clay area, that clay will compress, and from the surface it looks like the ground is dropping, and it actually, everything is lowering down somewhat, and like you said, it can lower inches over a year's time.
Kurt, because land can shift like that, fortunately in the San Joaquin Valley we're not too susceptible to earthquakes. Maybe over to the Kalinga side, yes. But I've looked at maps before that show seismic activity in Fresno County is one of the least affected by that situation. But with land sinking from pumping water, does that tend to bend pipes or crack cement collars on irrigation pumping and so forth? Is that something that you guys have to deal with from time to time?
Occasionally it does affect the casing in the wells.
I mean, it just makes sense if you got your pipes in there and the land starts to think something's going to give at some point.
Right, well, it's more of a vertical, so your pipe, or, you know,
Okay.
set in the ground vertically, so what can happen is you can have some compression. So you have compression breaks, but what we tend to do is when we install our casing, we put compression sections, which is basically a larger pipe inserted around a smaller diameter pipe, and it's like a telescope. So as subsidence may occur, it's able to compress down and not break the casing.
Kind of like a telescope, like a
Exactly.
kid with one of those things you'd go out like this. I didn't know that you could have a way to combat that and still be able to be viable in the pumping of that well. Yeah, I think I got off a little track there. I thought that maybe in the process of drilling for water that there's always a sending unit that has to maybe send it to a receiving or holding tank or something like that, and maybe that could be compromised. Not the case.
Not the case.
Okay. You primarily deal with ag? Is your staple of business, or do you also delve into the residential aspect of
Not so
drilling,
much
too?
residential, but we do a lot of municipal work as well.
Okay.
And you know, we also do some oil field, water supply, some industrial wells. So, we provide a full gamut of services to more than just one customer base.
Any fracking?
No.
Nothing of that yet, because I understand that takes a lot of water. They got to get it from somewhere and process it and then send it into these holding ponds and so forth with chemicals in it, and that's another issue in itself. We won't go there, but I just wanted to ask if you had an experience.
No, we haven't had any experience in that part of it.
Perhaps in the future you will. Interestingly enough, history repeats itself. Do you know what happened in May of 1977? I'm going to relate it to what's happening here, and this show is going to air sometime later in springtime. But the president's coming to town today, and he's supposed to address the water issues of Fresno and Fresno County and the Central Valley, probably from Bakersfield to Sacramento. Exactly the same thing happened in May of 1977. There was another president that came out to address the same issue. And that's why I asked you about the inception of your company. It seems like you guys were just on the tail end of the last great drought we had, which was, I believe, 1976-77, and Jimmy Carter came to the valley and addressed the drought issues. So not a lot got done between then and now, because we're still in the same boat 37, 38 years later. And I just thought that ironic that Jimmy Carter came out here and addressed the same problem. We just never seemed to do anything in our infrastructure to change the pattern. So just a little footnote for you, but I'm very interested in finding out more about how you guys install and how you find water and so forth. So we're going to reserve that for segment number 2, but anything else that you could add in terms of your capacity and your hours that you've been putting in? I know you guys have been working pretty hard lately. Is it a 24/7 operation now?
It's always been that way. We tend to run 2 12-hour shifts, so our men are working 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, and we work until the job is done, and then they take a break and then start on the new project.
And so you're busy.
We're busy.
Okay, well that's good. It's good to know that an industry in Fresno is doing well, and I'm always happy to be with businesses that do that. I'm with Bob Zimmerer, and Bob, I just wanted to pick up a little bit where I left off with Kurt, and that is, we had briefly discussed how the land is sinking in some places, and one of the other aspects that I was told about that is as this top layer of hardpan or clay compresses down, it's squeezing the capacity to store water between where water normally sits and the earth beneath that. Is that a possibility that someday, with compression and land sinking and continued droughts perhaps, that the ability for the soil to soak up the water could get more difficult?
No, you're really not changing the aquifers of the zones.
Okay.
That really wouldn't be squeezing, because you got your sands and everything, and they don't squeeze, and that's where your water zones are at. That's your aquifer zones.
Okay.
And that won't be squeezing. What's squeezing is your clay is squeezing down.
Yeah.
Not the zones where the water is at.
All right, and that clay is not real absorbent, I understand.
That's correct.
It kind of sits there as
there's no water.
Bottom of a swimming pool.
Right, there's no water in the clay zones.
Okay. Well, that leads me to another question with you. How do you go about finding water? Now, before you answer, I can harken back to seeing an episode of The Real McCoys where Walter Brennan's in his overalls and he's got I think a divining rod or something like that, and he's finding water. Now, I know that's not the way it's done anymore, but maybe at a time it was a kind of a stab in the dark to get water. What do you guys typically do nowadays?
Well, most of the time you're going from history of the surrounding wells around there. You got different depths. You know where the different zones are. That does vary in different places. Some places it'll change quite drastically. In other places, it really doesn't change over a big wide area, being like for miles. It won't change in the surface area. But you're doing mostly, it's a step process. You go through and you do all the research of existing wells. You work with existing hydrogeologists and geologists that know the area also. You can work with them. And then you do test holes or pilot hole drilling when you're drilling down first for a well. Say we're going to drill a 18-inch casing. Well, we'll go with a 17.5-inch pilot hole. Then we'll use E-log. And E-log really tells you a lot about what's down there.
Okay.
And what that does is it measures the resistivity in the aquifer, and when you got high resistivity, that means you're into the zones that produce water. So it tells you.
That's interesting. Does it have anything to do with sound waves coming back, or are you using a camera on the end of this?
It's not sound waves. There's people that do try to do the sound waves, Dale. There's, that's kind of like a glorified witcher that they do the sound down there, and they measure it back, and they try to determine where the water is by how much distance the sound was.
Yes.
It's a little iffy, just kind of like the witcher with the stick. Some people believe in it.
Yeah, I use that example kind of loosely because Grandpa was using a piece of wood or something.
Oh,
but
they
I
still
understand
use
that
it.
they have these rods, like metal rods that the guys can carry, and if they come together, that's an indication.
That's correct. And some people still believe in it. And for the small costs, if they feel better on doing that, we let them do that. That's
Sure.
really not a major deal.
Okay,
But
so
we're not going to base that much on it.
What you're saying is more information, the better.
That's
to
right.
make a sound
That's right.
determination of where you're going to
That's
actually
right.
drill.
There's all different faucets of.
Yeah.
finding it.
Now I heard that the industry price now is somewhere in the high 30s, like $35, $37 a foot.
That you mean for a little domestic well?
Well, I see. That's why I'm talking to
Sure,
you.
right,
You do ag, and
right.
you may do domestics
That
too.
would be more like a domestic well, where it should be more, for a house well for domestic. Where ag wells, it depends on the depth and so forth. The deeper you go,
the size of the casings you're
the
using,
size of the casing.
the motors at the bottom.
Right. The deeper the depth, you got time, so you got to be watching your clay zones and the risk factors, because you got to have a lot bigger equipment.
Yes.
So the price goes up somewhat there too.
Yes, and I was reading that some of these wells that agricultural people are having to dig are coming up to the price range of almost $500,000 in some cases.
That's correct. The deep well would be well above that even.
And if somebody were to sink a well, say that deep, which we're talking a long ways down, I'm sure, with a large casing going down in there, they're not guaranteed forever. It's going to maybe have to be dug again at some point, or does you go down deep enough to that you can wade the drought seasons versus the wet seasons?
That's true. That's true. I mean, a well in general, you might say it has a 60, 70-year life.
Okay.
In general. There's different materials that we do use. We use copper bearing, we use high-strength low alloy, and then the real exotic places, but they're usually too expensive for the ag farmers, is like in municipalities, we use stainless steel.
Okay.
Because the footprint, the infrastructure is so high in a municipality that they want to make sure the longevity increases up to, say, 150 years. Because when their payback would be tremendous, say, 70 years from now to re-drill a well, because the prices of everything, of course, keep going up over time.
Right. Now we're standing in one of your yards. We're on 3.5 acres, you said here, and it looks pretty full of gear right now. And you said that you have adjacent lots where you're storing gear for up to 10 different crews.
Correct. Right. Right now we're running 6 crews here, 6 drilling rigs, and we're running 6 drilling rigs in Bakersfield. We're soon to put up 1 more drilling rig here to try to help out of the situation we got going on right now.
And as Kurt pointed out, you guys are busy.
That's right.
You got plenty of work and maybe a backlog waiting to get work done by you guys.
We have too much work, actually.
Too much work. Well, okay. Let me ask you this question. Ag primarily is on the bottom of the valley. We're in this bowl here. Residential could be up in the foothills, perhaps.
Correct.
And now you're dealing with granite and rock fissures rather than the aquifer itself. And is it more difficult to locate the water at that point when you get into that kind of situation?
Yeah, mountain drilling is totally different. There it can change real drastically because you're just trying to find a crack basically in the granite where there might be some water, where you can move over 10 feet and you might hit water. It's a little bit more luck.
Yeah, and I have a personal experience about that. I live in an area called County Service Area 51 in Northeast Clovis, and we had been in a 12-year struggle to see if we were going to collectively pay for piped water to come into our area, and ultimately it didn't pass. So everybody's on their own well, and that's a unique situation being so close to the city of Clovis to be on your own well.
Correct.
But in my neighborhood, some people have run out of water, some people still have it, and it's been explained to me as you did, those rock fissures, they're very fickle in terms of where that water flow is.
That's-
And furthermore, somebody else told me if you live closer to the foothills that water isn't necessarily from the rainwater that settles down here. It's coming from the mountains down in those fissures
Correct.
from a higher elevation, which makes our snowpack all that much more important this year if we could get some.
That's right. There's areas even in the what we call somewhat in the valley floor, but it's on more in the foothills. You know, you get up around the La Grande and northeast of Chowchilla and Madura area.
Yes.
There's bad areas up there to where there's not much water. There's just not a real good underground aquifers up there.
I
So
see.
that's it's a little tougher up there. It's a little more hit and miss, and there's just not the quantity of water.
A neighbor up the street from me, about 3 doors up, had a company come in. He told them where he wanted to drill the first well. And he was very, very adamant about that. Well, they went down and down about 400 feet, couldn't find it. So now they went off to the next spot and tried it again, blank number 2. I don't imagine that happens very frequently when you just can't find it at all.
Not very frequently, not on the valley floor. Normally on the valley floor you will find it.
Okay.
But there is certain areas, like I just kind of explained
Sure.
up there and more in the foothills that,
Yeah,
that gets to be bad.
Right, I think that right now Shaver Lake is in a world of hurt because they're in a mountain area and they're already declaring themselves in danger of losing their water up there. Auberry, Meadow Lakes, places like that, but even down as far as Toll House and northeast Clovis against the foothills, I can see that that's happening. What would you recommend for people when they do drill wells? Get holding tanks and recharge areas where they can store more water so the pump doesn't have to work as hard once you sink the well and the pump?
Well, for
Because now we're getting into troubleshooting.
yeah,
here.
you're talking about for domestic wells, which
Yeah.
most of the people, a lot of people in the mountain areas, they have to have it because they might only have a 1-2 GPM well.
Sure.
That's all it makes. So they got to have a big storage tank with a booster pump to pump it up to satisfy their needs for somewhat fire protection and then for their needs.
What would somebody be looking for in terms of listening or hearing some telltale signs that maybe the well is starting to get weaker and having less water in it? Is there something that's obvious that would trigger the sound of the motor working a little longer, the less water going into your holding tank at a slower rate? Is that something that would be typical?
Well, yeah, that's a good question actually, because a part of our business that's really expanding is but basically the rehabs of wells, rehabilitation, because there's a lot of wells you can bring back to life they might have biofouling, which is bacteria growth, and then they have calcium deposits and everything else that's mineral deposits. And so
Okay.
and you actually clean that up by acid and air bursting
Sure.
and shocking it.
Sure.
So you bring that water back into it. You
All
make
right.
that well back to life.
When you're digging a well, do you try to stay away from an adjacent well as far as you can, or does that make any difference at all, how close you are to the next well?
Yes, I mean in the ag business, you would like to stay at least a quarter of a mile, and some places up to half a mile would be better, because otherwise, one person is going to be drawing off water from the other person, so they both might have a little deeper pumping level than what they would have to do.
Well, that sounds agricultural to me. The residential aspect, which I'm dealing with, we have people that are having wells sunk 100 yards from the next guy.
Correct, that's correct. But usually you're drawing a small amount of water to where that really probably is not a factor.
Sure.
Unless you're on a real bad area, which you are.
CSA 51 is not
right.
the greatest for water.
No,
Up by
it's
Dry Creek.
That's
It's
right.
named Dry Creek for a reason.
That's right. It's a hit and miss area there.
Yeah.
Real bad there.
Well, I'm really impressed. Your gear around here is enormous. And you have forklifts and trucks and booms and guys and welders and grinders and all kinds of things going into this effort. I just want to say thanks so much for being a part of this, and I'd like to get the phone number from you.
Okay, it's 559-834-1551.
Okay, and that's for residential as well as ag.
No, we don't really do much residential.
Okay.
Mostly ag and municipality and
Okay.
government projects.
Very good. And then I believe we have a website. I believe it's www.zimindustries.com. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So people can reach you on that phone number. Give it to me one more time.
Okay, the phone number is 559-834-1551.
and then www.zimindustries.com for the website.
And that's just one M, just ZIM.
Zim, yes, Zim. You know, it's funny because you guys are Zimmerers. But,
Correct.
all right, Zim Industries is the place to go to if you need to have well service. Bob, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for.
And what we're going to do is get some footage of your operation, and it's been a pleasure to talk to you. And thank you so much for being informative about the industry and what we're going through right now.
Well, I hope I assisted everybody.
Thank you very much for joining us on the Valley today, and it has been a pleasure to talking to the Zimmers. Thank you so much.